Good day. Today is Monday, 10th February 2025, and somewhat unusually for recent programs, I'm going to start with a brief discussion about some of the latest events on the contact line in the fighting which has been taking place, well, not in fact in Ukraine, but in Russia, in Kursk region. Now, over the course of this last week, we've had many reports about an attempted Ukrainian offensive seeking to capture the village of Ruskaya Konopielka and to advance beyond that and to capture the village of Ulanek. Now, I've discussed the course of that offensive in previous programs. I said that judging from the information provided by Group of Forces North, the Russian military force that is defending Kursk region and which is now completing the capture of Volchansk in Kharkiv region, judging by what they've been saying, this offensive that the Ukrainians launched was a failure. Now, I think as the days have passed since we got news about what the Ukrainians attempted, with most of the Ukrainian effort having taken place on the 6th of February, anyway, with every day that's passed since then, it's become clear that Group of Forces North were reporting the battle in Kursk region accurately. The Ukrainians did launch an offensive. The offensive was repelled by the Russians. The Ukrainians did fail to make no significant progress at all. But what I, for one, had not appreciated before, something that has only become clear to me over the course of the last 24 hours, is the sheer scale of this Ukrainian offensive and the extent of the Ukrainian defeat and indeed of the debacle. Now, I say that because we've now been getting more and more photographic and film evidence from the area where the fighting was taking place. We've had more reports from Group of Forces North. We've had pictures of the roads in this area littered with destroyed Ukrainian armoured vehicles and trucks and things of that kind. There's been some very distressing pictures as well, showing dead Ukrainian soldiers. But it's clear that this was a major operation attempted by Ukraine, a major operation, clearly one backed by the Western powers, involving large amounts of military equipment. It's clearly something that had been prepared well in advance, probably going back weeks, in other words, before the change of administration in Washington. I strongly suspect, by the way, that much of the military equipment that the Biden administration was rushing to Ukraine in the last weeks of its existence was intended for use in this very same operation in Kursk region. And it has failed catastrophically. The losses in equipment have been enormous, far beyond what I had initially imagined. And I suspect that the Ukrainian losses are not only much greater at a personnel level, but they call into question my initial assumption that only 2 battalions of the Ukrainian military had been involved in the attack. Someone, somewhere, in Kiev, in Washington, as I said before, the 20th of January, appears to have hoped that some kind of breakthrough could be achieved in Kursk region, that the Russians would be thrown onto the defensive there. A major effort was made to pull together equipment to increase the number of Ukrainian armoured forces that could be deployed to this attack. It seems that a major effort also was made to increase drone activity over the battlefield and to develop electronic warfare systems to jam the Russian drones. And clearly, this thing was very, very carefully planned and prepared, and probably carefully planned and prepared with the assistance of the Western powers. And it was a complete disaster. Not only was it a disaster, but it has opened up possibilities for further Russian advances, because though the Ukrainians apparently continue to transport equipment to Kursk region along the road between Sumy, the city of Sumy in Ukraine, and Sudzha, the one town that the Ukrainians control in Kursk region, though apparently there is an almost constant flow of men and machines along this road. It looks as if some vital units were redeployed from other places in the Kursk region to support this offensive. And the result has been that the Ukrainian position in parts of Kursk region has weakened, and this has now enabled the Russians to occupy extensive parts of the village of Sverdlikovo, northwest of Sudzha, so that Ukrainian control of that village is now very, very much in doubt, with the real prospect that Sverdlikovo could pass entirely under Russian control at some point within the next, say, week or 2 weeks, in which case the Russians would be strategically positioned to start blocking the road between Sumy region and Sudzha. In other words, a huge, reckless gamble was played out in Kursk region. It has, I have to say, about it, some of the look of desperation about it as well. Anyway, a huge, desperate gamble was played in Kursk region, committing large numbers of men and machines to try to attack the Russians south of Sudzha, and it miscarried completely, with catastrophic losses and potentially catastrophic consequences. Now, all of this, it seems to me, begs many questions about the standard of decision-making in Kiev, about who, in fact, is making the decisions. I suspect that Zelensky himself has been heavily focused on this operation in Kursk for a very, very long time. But the scale of which this was done, to repeat again, makes me sure that there were senior people in the Biden administration who were backing it, and that this was their last big throw before they quit the scene. They were hoping somehow to turn the tables on the Russians in Kursk region, and a lot of the machines, as I said, the extra tanks, the extra Bradleys and the extra Strikers that were sent to Ukraine appear to have been committed to this particular operation. Well, there it is. I suspect that whenever the Ukrainians now do try and launch offensives, we're going to see the same outcome play out. Group of Forces North has been warning for some days now that the Ukrainians are concentrating significant numbers of troops in Kharkiv region, and that there is going to be an attempted Ukrainian offensive in Kharkiv region, possibly towards Volchansk, to try to push the Russians out of Volchansk. Group of Forces North say that they have complete knowledge of the whole of this operation and how it will play out, that they're ready for it, that they will repel it, that the Ukrainian troops who are being mobilized to carry out this operation are poorly trained and have low morale. And the group of forces north not only predict that the offensive in Kharkiv region, if it happens, will fail, but they're saying that they stand ready to take advantage of that failure and to bring more territory in Kharkiv region under the control of Russia. Anyway, as far as I'm concerned, as I said, this has all of the look about it of a desperate throw, maybe not yet the last throw, but it reinforces my sense that we are now, certainly in military terms, in the war in Ukraine, entering the end game. Now, since I've started on military developments, I think it's only fair and reasonable if I do a quick roundup of what's going on in other places. It seems to me that the major focus of the Russians is in two areas at the moment. One is in the area on the west bank of the Oskol River. The Ukrainians are starting to show signs of panic in this area. The Russians established their bridgehead west of the Oskol River, north of Kupiansk. The reports are that the Ukrainians have been rushing reinforcements to this area to try to stop the expansion of the Russian bridgehead and, if possible, to drive the Russians back. Every Ukrainian counterattack, however, appears to fail. And with every day now, we get further news of how this bridgehead is being expanded and how the Russians are capturing more and more villages and small settlements in this area, expanding the bridgehead all the time. And there are reports that the Russians are preparing a further bridgehead west of the Oskol River, if I've understood this correctly, south of Kupiansk. So it looks as if Kupiansk could soon find itself encircled if the Ukrainians are unwise to try to cling on there. And anyway, one way or the other, before long, if not now, the Russians will achieve critical mass in this area and they will begin the big offensive, which they are undoubtedly preparing, probably towards Kupiansk and Izium and Balakleya, the places that they withdrew from in the autumn of 2022, but conceivably northwards towards Volchansk as well, taking the Ukrainian defenders there, attacking them from the rear. So anyway, that's one area where the Russians are very, very busy. The other area where the Russians appear to be very busy at the moment is Chasiv Yar. This has been a long slug battle. I mean, the Russians have met intense resistance from the Ukrainians in Chasiv Yar. Ukraine continuously sends more and more troops to try to defend Chasiv Yar. The Russians have apparently had supply difficulties because getting supplies across the major pipes of the Seversky Donetsk aqueduct has been a problem, but steadily, gradually, they've managed to extend the area that they control west of the aqueduct. They apparently now control around 2/3 of Chasiv Yar. It looks as if probably sometime in March, Chasiv Yar will have been brought fully under Russian control. And the other area where the Russians are heavily focused and where they continue to advance is in southwest Donbass, southwest of Pokrovsk. The Russians continue to advance west of Selidovo. We get lots of reports of more and more settlements there, steadily coming under Russian control. And also this big fortified area southwest of Kurakovo. That is starting to crack. The village of Dachny apparently has fallen entirely under Russian control. I gather that the Russians now control either the entirety of the fortified village of Andreevka or at least most of it. And apparently there's reports that another village in this general area called Uspenovka has now also been captured. And in the area of Kotlino and Udachnye, immediately to the southwest of Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians have launched multiple, apparently unsuccessful attempts to try to push the Russians out of Kotlino, even as the Russians have expanded their control along the railway lines, and there are reports that they are now close to capturing the village of Udachnye, which lies to the southwest of Kotlino. So lots of battles going on. These battles look to me to be preparatory to the big Russian offensive, which is probably going to play out in the spring. And in the meantime, we continue to receive in many places all sorts of articles about the critical state of the Ukrainian armed forces, how short they are of equipment. There was a fascinating article that Jeff Roberts, the British historian, passed to me about the catastrophe of the newly trained brigade, Anna of Kiev, trained at a cost of 900 million euros in France, almost €1 billion spent on training one brigade. It was sent to the battle lines south of Pokrovsk, where it disintegrated immediately. Now, this article and the Ukrainian military commentator Yuri Butusov have repeatedly complained about the Ukrainian practice of feeding reinforcements into newly created brigades, which as a result are raw. They have no experienced soldiers, as opposed to reinforcing veteran brigades on the actual battlefronts. So the result is that the experienced, tough, veteran brigades are continuously short of men and are outmatched by the Russians on the contact line, whereas these newly trained brigades are really unfit for immediate battle in the demanding conditions of the Ukrainian conflict. I think that some of the blame, no doubt, does attach to Zelensky and Syrskyi for this. But I'm going to make a further point, one which I've not seen anybody mention before. But I think if you really want to allocate blame for the fact that instead of the Ukrainians feeding men who are recently called up and trained to the experienced brigades, if you really want to complain that instead of that happening, entirely new brigades that are raw and untested for battle are being created, then the main blame for that lies with the West. You have all of these various countries, France, Germany and Britain, and I believe the Italians are also involved, and the Americans no doubt are involved too. Each of them insists on training Ukrainian units and providing training for Ukraine. The governments of these countries all brag about the fact that they are doing this. Anyway, the result is that, of course, governments want to train entire brigades. They don't want to train Ukrainian soldiers piecemeal so that they can be distributed right across all of the various units on the battlefronts. Macron doesn't want to say, well, you know, I've sent all of these men to the battlefronts, but you can't really see them. You must take my word for it that I have actually trained them. He wants to show not just the French people, but the other NATO leaders, these new shiny brigades equipped with French equipment and French-trained soldiers, and I'm sure that in Germany and in Britain it is no different. So it is they, probably more than the Ukrainians, who insist on this practice of training new brigades from the bottom up, even though this is a completely inefficient way to use manpower. And back to a point that Brian Belletic, I remember making many months ago, maybe even years ago. All Western armies, French, German, British, American, have different training systems, different training concepts. You wouldn't probably anyway want to mix newly trained soldiers from different countries together into one and the same unit, because they're all trained in a different way. They all have different expectations of how orders are given. They all have completely different ideas about how to conduct combat. If you start doing that, you will probably end up with Frankenstein brigades that are incoherent and aren't functioning properly. And as it happens, every day almost now, I receive complaints from soldiers. I read complaints from soldiers of veteran brigades who complain about the incompetence, the inefficiency of whatever reinforcements they do actually get. Far from being happy when they get reinforced, they actually more often than not complain about the quality of the reinforcements that they receive. So just say, these are structural problems. These are deep-rooted structural problems that almost certainly cannot be addressed in a simple way. They are a sign of what others like Big Serge has talked about when he talked about the collapse of an army, the Ukrainian army, into incoherence and the cannibalization of units. Simplicius the thinker talks about these things in the same sort of way. These are symptoms of an army that is losing the war, an army that is increasingly making desperate throws of the dice, like the one we've just seen in Kursk. All of which point to trends in the war that are almost certainly irreversible. Anyway, let's move on and let's talk about the diplomatic situation. Now, Donald Trump has had more comments to make, and I understand that he spoke to Reuters. It's very difficult to get the exact words that he has been giving to the Western journalists, the various journalists that he's been speaking to. I've been checking the White House website, but they don't publish all of his remarks there, and all of his recent comments about Ukraine, none of them so far have appeared on the White House website. Anyway, Trump has been apparently talking again, and he has again said, or appeared to confirm, that he and Putin have been having discussions, that there is conversations underway between himself and Putin. In fact, he's been dropping many heavy hints that there has been more than one conversation between Putin and himself. Now, the Russians are maintaining a stolid silence about this. Peskov yesterday, when Trump first said that there'd been conversations between Putin and Trump, refused to confirm or deny this. He did say, however, that eventually the Russians would provide information when there was something of substance to report. I have to assume, given what Trump has been saying, that there have been conversations between Putin and Trump. I'm guessing more than one. And I'm going to make a further guess that at some point over the next couple of days, the Kremlin will publish a readout which will provide us with a summary of the Russian perspective on all of these conversations. It's clear to me that the Russians have been taken aback by what Trump has been saying. I think there'd been some agreement earlier that the fact that these conversations were taking place would be kept secret, at least for the time being, or at least would not be published so that the world in general would not know about them. I'm sure that political leaders in Ukraine, in China, those sort of places have been briefed by the American and Russian governments about them. But anyway, there was an agreement that it would be kept out of the public news. And I think the Russians were surprised when Trump went back on that agreement and have been unclear how to respond. But I think at some point, as I said, over the next couple of days, the Russians will confirm that there have indeed been ongoing discussions between Putin and Trump, and we will have a Russian readout published. I'm also going to say that I now think that when Peskov said a couple of days ago that there'd been an intensification of contacts between Russian and American government agencies, what he was actually alluding to was these discussions between Putin and Trump. Now, Trump has not given us his account of what Putin and Trump said to each other, but he has given us one or two clues. At least I'm getting this from some of the reports which I've heard and seen. So apparently, Putin did confirm to Trump that the Russians are prepared to sit down and negotiate about the conflict in Ukraine. They have no preconditions to talks. They've always said that. They're happy to talk to the Americans. They're happy to talk to the Ukrainians as well. This has never been an issue. Secondly, Putin clearly confirmed to Trump that he does care about the fact that Russian soldiers are dying on the battlefields. The idea that he is indifferent to the loss of human life, specifically Russian lives, well, that isn't true, and Putin will have confirmed that to Trump. But again, and we're taking this entirely from Trump, apparently there was some argument, or at least there has been an argument, about the territory which the Russians insist that at the end of the war they must control. Putin again reiterated what he said at the June 2024 Foreign Ministry meeting, that the Ukrainians must pull out completely from the four regions, that there must be no Ukrainian troops in the four regions, that all of these four regions are Russian, that includes the city of Kherson on the west bank of the Dnieper in Kherson region, and it includes the city of Zaporozhye, which the Russians also intend to control, which is on the east bank of the Dnieper, and of course it also includes the three important towns of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk and Konstantinovka. And from the tone of what Trump says, it seems as if Putin made it very clear, again, that he would only agree to a ceasefire if the Ukrainians pulled out of the four regions. And that was what he said. That's what Putin said at the June 2024 Foreign Ministry conference. And apparently he repeated that to Trump. Anyway, Trump apparently pushed back. And then Putin said that he cannot negotiate on the status of the four regions because they have been admitted to Russia through the provisions of the Russian constitution. And Trump apparently at that point said that this is absolutely absurd. You can't rely on the Russian constitution to say where the borders are. What the United States could do, if the Russians insisted on that position, is get Ukraine to change its constitution to include all sorts of Russian regions as its own, and that just as that is absurd, so what Putin is saying about these four regions being Russian because the Russian constitution says so, that is absurd as well. Now, Trump didn't say how Putin responded to that, but I'm going to make a guess. I'm going to suggest that probably what Putin said to Trump is that he doesn't take the Ukrainian constitution seriously. Why would he, after all? The Ukrainian constitution started with a commitment that Ukraine would remain a neutral country. It was then changed to say that Ukraine would join NATO. The president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, was removed from office in 2014, even though there was no provision in the constitution that enabled that to happen. And the Ukrainians have shown complete indifference to their constitution because Vladimir Zelensky continues to occupy the office of President of Ukraine, even though his constitutional term has ended. So Putin will have probably told Trump that he doesn't take the Ukrainian constitution or any of its provisions seriously, but that he does take Russia's constitution extremely seriously because he not only has sworn an oath to uphold it, but because it is the source of his power. It is what makes him the legitimate president of Russia. That is the kind of response I would expect Putin to make. It is a lawyer's response. And as I've pointed out on many occasions, Putin is a consummate lawyer. Whether that will have cut any ice with Donald Trump, well, clearly the fact that Trump has brought up this point about Russian demands for the entirety of the four regions and has called it absurd, that suggests obviously that Trump has not taken seriously whatever points it was that Putin made to him. So if this exchange is being reported correctly, then that implies that there has still been no understanding reached between Putin and Trump about the way forward, and that Putin is taking a very firm line and that he is sticking to the position he outlined in his speech to the Foreign Ministry Board in June 2024, and that, to put it simply, so far he is not giving an inch. Now, I think this is probably true, and we have actually had certain comments from various Russian officials that appear to bear that out. So we've had a statement, comments by Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister, Mikhail Galuzin, and he's made comments to the Russian newspaper Izvestia, in which he appears to cast doubt on whether the Western powers, the United States, Donald Trump, are even actually serious about wanting a negotiated solution to the conflict in Ukraine. This is what TASS reports Galuzin as having said to Izvestia. We are observing that recently probably over the past couple of weeks, the collective West, and particularly the United States and its new administration, have been talking about the need for the swiftest relaunch and resumption of a negotiation process in order to move toward the political and diplomatic settlement of the Ukraine crisis. So far, such statements have only been made in the public space, and we do not have any official inquiries on that matter. Now, that's already an interesting point, because despite the discussions between Putin and Trump, which Trump tells us have been taking place, the Russians still have not received any official invitation to begin negotiations or any serious proposal about negotiations. At least that is what Galuzin is telling us, and this is being reported by TASS today. And then Galuzin went on to say this: but I have to say that with all these seemingly positive statements, actually nothing has changed, given that the West continues to flood the Kiev regime with arms. We observe this fact and take it into account in our policy above all. In total, over almost 3 years, the volume of weapons provided to the Kiev regime has amounted to about $200 billion. So Galuzin is saying, and one must assume here that he's speaking for the Russian government, after all he is Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia, he says, look, we're hearing all of these nice things from the Americans about the war needing to end, about negotiations, about doing a deal. We hear all of that, but we've so far received nothing concrete, nothing that we can work with. What we are seeing instead is the continued supply of Western weapons to Ukraine. That continues, and whilst it continues, we will retain our doubts about how serious the West, including the United States, really is about its desire for a negotiated solution. So that was Galuzin. He's expressing Russian skepticism here. Now, we've also had some very, very tough points from the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia. Now, Nebenzia is, if I may say so, what we call in Britain a bruiser. He is, in other words, a very, very tough and formidable individual indeed. He's somebody who speaks very forthrightly and sometimes in a very fierce way, and never, I should say, in an impolite or improper way, but anyway, there's never any doubt about what he means. And I've noticed that the Russians wheel him out whenever they want to make a particularly tough point, because they know that he will set it out toughly. So what we read is that Nebenzia gave an interview to the Russian RIA Novosti news agency today, that he said that all the rumors about the possible deployment of peacekeepers from Europe to Ukraine were bizarre. He said that this speculation obviously stemmed from what he called a general fatigue about the crisis, and then he hit home. He said peacekeepers cannot operate without a mandate from the UN Security Council. Otherwise, any foreign military contingent sent into combat zones will be regarded as ordinary combatants under international law and a legitimate military target for our armed forces. And Novosti, RIA Novosti, has pointedly reminded everybody that Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, meaning that it has right of veto over any resolution to send foreign troops to Ukraine. So what Nebenzia is saying is that the Americans, the Europeans, are talking about peacekeeping contingents to Ukraine. These are absolutely bizarre proposals. Any peacekeepers sent to Ukraine will be treated by the Russians as combatants. The only agency that has a right to decide on deploying peacekeepers is the Security Council, the UN Security Council, and of course Russia has right of veto over any decision of that nature made by the UN Security Council. And any discussions about deploying peacekeepers between France, Britain, the United States and Ukraine therefore has no legal meaning at all. And if those so-called peacekeepers are ever deployed without the UN Security Council, in other words, Russia approving it to Ukraine, then those are enemy combatants and the Russians will attack them. So, again, we see the Russians taking a strong position here and Nebenzia expressing it in the usual forthright terms that he usually does. So far, the indications are that the Russians are not bending. And, by the way, they are now getting clear indications of support from their various allies. I say that in the context of the threats the Russians have apparently been receiving from the United States, from the new administration, the threats to wage all-out economic war on Russia. As I discussed in my previous program, Russia as a self-sufficient economy, self-sufficient in raw materials, food and energy, and a country with a significant industrial base, can probably withstand that kind of economic siege better than almost any other country. And by the way, has done so in the past. It did so, for example, during the Second World War. And you could argue that most of the Soviet period was another case of Russia continuing to operate under siege in exactly that kind of way. Anyway, the Russians apparently are telling each other that they both can and should resist this kind of economic pressure. But, as I've also said, the Russians almost certainly don't believe that Trump or the administration will ever do this, because it would mean sanctioning or imposing secondary sanctions or threatening secondary sanctions over almost every country in the world outside the collective West: China, India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, Malaysia, you name it. They would all have to be sanctioned. Turkey as well, with the Turk Stream pipeline. They would all have to be sanctioned and told to stop trading with Russia. There would be a sudden catastrophic shortage around the world of Russian energy and food and other products. It would cause a huge global economic crisis, which would be bound to affect the United States itself. And of course, when Putin was interviewed about these kind of threats by his favorite journalist, Pavel Zarubin, about 2 weeks ago, he actually went and said that he doesn't believe that President Trump would ever go down the road of taking these sort of measures, because President Trump is very careful about the welfare of the American people and the stability of the American economy, and he would surely never do something that would backfire against the United States and undermine American economic stability so completely as an economic war against Russia might do. So the Russians see these threats of economic war as a bluff they intend to call, and they're telling themselves that even if they're not a bluff, they can withstand them as they have in the past. And in the meantime, this will cause economic chaos around the world, for which the United States and Donald Trump personally will be blamed. And it will cause huge economic problems in Europe and in the United States itself. And I think the Russians probably calculate that the United States would not be able to enforce an economic war against Russia for any very long period anyway. It would eventually have to pull back, leaving the Russians in an even stronger position than the one in which they already are. So I think the Russians are not intimidated by these threats, but they've now had what are in effect messages from friendly countries that who must be aware of these threats of economic war coming from the Trump administration. They've now had actions taken by these governments, which has almost certainly reassured the Russians of the strong support they have globally from their friends. So today we've had a confirmation that President Xi Jinping of China has accepted President Putin's offer and will travel to Russia and attend the Victory Day celebrations in Moscow on the 9th of May. And apparently Xi Jinping has made reciprocal invitation, has given Putin a reciprocal invitation for Putin to attend China's Victory Day celebrations. This is China's victory in the Second World War. Many people, by the way, if the Russians complain that in the West far too little is known about Russia's enormous contribution to the Allied victory in the Second World War, the Chinese have arguably an even greater right to complain about that as well. Almost no one that I know in the West realizes that China made a huge contribution to the Allied victory over Japan and ultimately to the Allied victory in the Second World War. Just saying. But anyway, the Chinese celebrate their victory with huge ceremonies in September, and apparently Putin has been invited to attend them. And so Xi Jinping is coming to Moscow on the 9th of May. Apparently Lula, the president of Brazil, has accepted an invitation to go as well. So he will be in Moscow on the 9th of May. Putin, or at least the Russians, not Putin, the Russians have recently been hosting India's defense minister, who has been again in Moscow, even as the Russians have sent their Sukhoi 57 fifth generation fighter jet to attend an air show in India, where, by the way, it will be competing directly against the American F-35, just saying. Anyway, the Indian defense minister is apparently also again in Russia. And there are reports today that the Indian government is now close to agreeing with the Russians the terms and itinerary of Putin's own visit to India, which is expected to take place over the next few weeks. So India India, China, Brazil, Russia's big BRICS allies are coming along, and in effect they're telling the Americans, look, our relations with the Russians remain firm. We are perhaps aware, in fact we are definitely aware, of all of these threats of economic war against Russia. We don't support them. If you decide to launch an economic war against the Russians, well, obviously we will take whatever step we can to defend and protect our own economies. But don't expect us to be on board with you or to willingly comply with all of the various anti-Russian steps that you will be demanding that we take. So this is an important show of support for the Russians, and one which, of course, the Russians will have noticed and which will reinforce their positions in the negotiations that are coming. So, in summary, telephone conversations apparently taking place between Putin and Trump. I suspect that there has been more than one. Indications that the Russians are taking a firm line in those discussions. Putin insisting on the 4 regions, making it absolutely clear that he's not prepared to retreat from Istanbul Plus. The Russians making further points publicly. Galuzin says that the Russians aren't even sure that all this talk of negotiations is for real, because the West continues to arm Ukraine. And Nebenzia saying that all this talk about peacekeepers to Ukraine is completely bizarre. There can be no peacekeepers in Ukraine without the Security Council agreeing, and the UN Security Council includes Russia, and Russia has a veto, with the implication being that Russia will exercise its veto to stop peacekeepers, so-called peacekeepers, being deployed. So the Russians taking a strong line, as one would expect them to do in negotiations, telling the Americans, in effect, that we know you're bluffing about your threats of economic war. And as for the various offers that you're making about Nord Stream, about reconnections to SWIFT, about all of that, I suspect the Russians are saying 2 things. Firstly, we don't really believe you. We don't really believe that you mean any of that. We've seen promises like that made before, and they're not honoured. And besides, as far as we are concerned, this conflict is about security. And though we would like to see Nord Stream back in action, we would like to be reconnected to SWIFT, why not? We would like to have our $300 billion frozen in the West. We would like to have all of that repaid to us. We're not going to agree to all of those things and compromise our security in the process. So, the Russians, in other words, taking, for the moment, a firm line, but also telling the Americans, yes, nonetheless, in spite of all of that, while we are not impressed by your threats, and we are not impressed by your inducements, your bribes, nonetheless, we do want the war to end, and we are prepared to sit down with you and to talk and to see whether we can find a mutually acceptable way forward. Now, the Americans, in the meantime, are busy. In a few short weeks, a couple of days, in fact, the Munich Security Conference begins. J.D. Vance, the Vice President, is on his way. He is a known skeptic about the war. I remember him reading a piece that he had written shortly after Ukraine's catastrophically unsuccessful 2023 summer offensive, in which he made the simple point, a point which up to then hardly anyone in the discussions in the United States had made, the simple point that the United States is not in a position, realistically, to increase on the weapons it had supplied to Ukraine prior to that offensive, so that any further weapons that the United States supplied to Ukraine was simply throwing away more weapons on top of all of the other weapons that had been wasted, and that it was a case, in effect, of doing the same thing again and again and again, and expecting a different result, something which all of the evidence suggests is not going to happen. I have also got the clear impression that Vance is not someone who is particularly impressed by the Ukrainian leader, Vladimir Zelensky. So Vance is going to be representing the United States at the Munich Security Conference. Kellogg will, of course, also be there, and he said that he's going to outline his plan at the Munich Security Conference. In itself, by the way, a mistake. The Russians have bad memories about the Munich Security Conference. It was at the Munich Security Conference in 2007 that Putin, to a uniformly hostile reaction, set out his speech criticizing the unipolar system. It's actually worth taking time out and tracking down the film of Putin speaking at the 2007 Munich Security Conference and seeing the furious, angry faces of the American and Western delegates as they were listening to him. Just saying. And of course, the Russians have not forgotten, as I have never forgotten, how it was at the Munich Security Conference that Zelensky first floated the idea of Ukraine acquiring nuclear weapons without anybody paying any attention, without any pushback from people in the audience, and how Western leaders seemed to fall over each other to denounce Russia and to talk about the enormous sanctions that they were preparing to impose on Russia when the conflict in Ukraine began, which of course it proceeded to do just days later. So the Russians have bad memories of the Munich Security Conference, and I have to say, I don't think they will take kindly to the announcement of a peace plan by Kellogg there. They will want to know why Kellogg is announcing a peace plan at all before he has even spoken to them. Just saying. So I think that is an ill-judged move by Kellogg, but there it is. Kellogg, in the meantime, as you can see from his X account, has been busy meeting all sorts of European officials and European leaders. He seems to be talking almost exclusively to the most hardline people that he can find in Europe, including people from the Baltic states. So I don't think the Russians are expecting much from him, but I think that they will be listening very carefully to what J.D. Vance has to say. I think they do know about J.D. Vance's previous criticisms of the war, and they will be looking not just at the words that follow the meeting that apparently is going to take place in Munich, between J.D. Vance and Zelensky. But they will probably also be looking at the body language. They'll be looking to see what the demeanor of Vance and Zelensky is, and they'll be asking themselves, what is the real mood and the real feeling between the two? So things are moving on the diplomatic chessboard. The Russians, however, fine chess players, as of course they are sorting out their positions. They're waiting to see what the Americans come up with. And of course, in the meantime, Vladimir Putin is explaining, or so I believe, his positions directly to Donald Trump. Trump doesn't always like all of the things that Putin says, but he seems on balance to be pleased about the fact that he has a dialogue going with Putin, and hopefully that dialogue will be taken further. Anyway, we shall see where all of this goes. There is a possibility that this could all fall apart at some point over the next couple of weeks. But my own sense, my own general feeling is that Donald Trump most definitely does want to be rid of Project Ukraine. And you can even see this from some of the things that people like Mike Waltz are saying. Mike Waltz, for example, has spoken about how any security guarantees for Ukraine would have to be provided by the Europeans. The United States apparently will not be involved in providing security guarantees. Donald Trump himself has said that maybe the United States might be prepared to provide security guarantees to Ukraine in return for Ukrainian mineral deposits. And he's talked about the United States doing a $500 million deal with Ukraine for those mineral deposits. Apparently, some of that money is intended to be set off against the aid, the financial aid that the United States has already provided to Ukraine. So, in effect, the Ukrainians would be expected to part with their strategic minerals free. The German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, has already criticised this idea. My own view is that this is all complete fantasy and unreal, and Trump himself knows it. The key point is that Mike Waltz is coming and saying that the Americans are not going to be providing Ukraine with long-term security guarantees. Just saying. So I think that the Americans, the Trump administration, are looking to pull out of Ukraine. They've said as much. They've said that Asia, the Indo-Pacific, is for them the priority. They've spoken about the importance of focusing on reindustrialization in the United States, of getting the situation within the United States sorted. Trump and Musk are involved in a massive battle against the permanent state within the United States, the deep state if you prefer. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of people across the US government are being sacked. Institutions like the FBI, perhaps the CIA, possibly the Justice Department, maybe eventually the Treasury are being purged. USAID has been all but closed down. There's going to be legal challenges galore. I've just had an article sent to me by Eve Smith of Naked Capitalism. It's an article by it's in a website called ProPublica, which is a legal affairs website. And they argue that many of these steps taken against USAID by the Trump administration are illegal. I think, by the way, formally they make a compelling case. It is the case that USAID was administering funds authorized by Congress. And I'm not sure that the president and his officials have the legal or constitutional authority to interfere with that. But they have interfered with it. They have, in effect, closed down USAID. There will be court cases. Those court cases could last months or even years. I can't imagine that at the end of this process, Humpty Dumpty, if I can put it like that, will be put back together again. I can't imagine that USAID will be restored in its pre-existing form. Just saying. And of course, I'm not an expert on US constitutional law. For all I know, ProPublica are wrong, and that the Supreme Court of the United States might side with the president on this. Anyway, we shall see. But that must be the primary focus of the administration. Events back home in terms of foreign policy confronting China in the Indo-Pacific. Ukraine is a distraction. It is, as far as the Trump people are concerned, it is a bottomless pit into which the United States pours in resources. I think that if Mike Waltz and Kellogg do insist on all-out economic war against Russia, the people who run the economics departments in the United States, the Federal Reserve Board, the Treasury Department, the Commerce Department, will come along and say to the president, this is simply unrealistic. It's going to cause immense damage. We can't allow this to happen. And I think the president will go with those views. So my own guess is that at some point, at some moment over the next few months, the penny will drop. The Americans will accept that the Russians are winning the war, and they will tell the Ukrainians that the only real way forward is for Ukraine to accept, perhaps with a few modifications on the margins, Istanbul Plus, Putin's proposals made in June 2024. After all, how do those proposals undercut the core interests of the United States? Just saying. So the Americans will probably tell Zelensky and the Europeans to accept those proposals. And if they don't accept the proposals, well, the Americans will say, well, in that case, this is your problem from now on. You people in Europe and you people in Ukraine can sort it out. We've got other, more important things to do. If I was going to make a guess, I would say that is probably the direction in which we are ultimately heading. Now, one thing I do want to say, and I do want to stress, is that if what Trump is saying is true, if he is speaking to Putin, if he's having telephone calls, and for all I know, more than one telephone call with Putin, then the Americans are talking to the Russians. And the Americans are talking to the Russians about Ukraine without the Ukrainians and without the Europeans. For the Europeans, and obviously for the Ukrainians, that is the ultimate nightmare. For as long as I can remember, this has been the spectre that has haunted Europe, that the Americans and the Russians will come together and they will decide the affairs of Europe with each other. And the Europeans will be marginalized and left out in the cold. To understand how haunted the Europeans are about this, all you need to do is to go back to the Yalta conference, which, by the way, the Russians have been increasingly talking about over the last couple of days. We are now at the 80th anniversary of the Yalta conference. The Russians have increasingly been talking about the need for a new Yalta. What they really mean when they talk about a new Yalta, in my opinion, and Lavrov, by the way, has provided an immensely erudite article explaining how Yalta created the modern system of international relations based on the United Nations and the UN Charter. Lavrov, by the way, overstates things. Jeff Roberts, the British historian, has actually written a very good piece about Yalta, which I believe he wrote 10 years ago, actually, in which he pointed out that, in fact, the Yalta conference was a much, much more modest affair than people realize. Mostly, it signed off on things that had already been agreed. There were discussions about Poland's western border and the makeup of the future Polish government, about which, by the way, a consensus was reached. And there were arguments about the future of Germany, about which agreements were also reached. But the mythology that the leaders at Yalta actually divided Europe into spheres of influence and that they created the whole future structure of international relations really doesn't correspond to the actual record of what was really discussed at Yalta. The key thing about Yalta, the thing that the Russians remember about Yalta, is that at Yalta, the Russians and the Americans, Stalin and Roosevelt, had a proper discussion with each other and were basically discussing directly with each other the settlement of the affairs of Europe and the settlement of the peace after the Second World War. The British were most unhappy. They were worried about the fact that the Americans and the Russians, Stalin and Roosevelt, seemed to be working together and deciding things without the British. And this concern the British had, which was not just manifest at Yalta, by the way, it was also manifest at other wartime conferences as well, has carried over into Europe ever since. There's always been the worry that there are only really two superpowers in Europe, America and Russia, that in their own interests they will come to a deal, and that the Europeans will be left with a fait accompli they might not like, but one which will inevitably downgrade their importance. I remember people worrying about this also in Europe during the détente period of the early 1970s, for example. Tensions between the Americans and the Russians are always preferable for the Europeans at some level to an actual consensus between the Americans and the Russians about Europe. And the fact that Trump and Putin are apparently now in contact and are talking about things with each other and are debating how to move forward, for the Europeans, potentially that is a nightmare. And you can see how the Europeans are responding to all of this. Ursula von der Leyen has just been to the Baltic states, and she's talking again about the EU becoming a military alliance like NATO, perhaps in place of NATO. It's preparing for this terrible day when the Europeans find that the Americans and the Russians are doing deals with each other, and the Americans, in a sense, are going away. Macron is talking about how bad it would be for the Americans to impose tariffs on Europe and how important it is for the Americans to work with the Europeans on European matters. And we also see this very, very bizarre business now about European energy policy, because the Europeans must be becoming increasingly concerned that they've got their energy policy completely wrong. They've cut themselves off from Russian pipeline gas. There are some people, as we saw from that article recently in the Financial Times, who are saying, well, maybe we were too hasty. Maybe we should start looking for ways to have Russian pipeline gas come back into Europe again. And we know that the European Commission is dead against this. Well, Ursula von der Leyen, even as she talks about moving forward with recreating the European Union into some kind of defense alliance, she's also hailing the fact that the Baltic states have now cut themselves off from the Russian electricity grid, of which they were once a part, a legacy of the Soviet period. She talks about this as an act of liberation. She says that it means that the Baltic states can no longer be intimidated or blackmailed by the Russians anymore. I cannot recall a single occasion, by the way, when the Russians have threatened to switch off electricity supplies to the Baltic states in return for political concessions. Just saying. I never remember it happening. But anyway, that's not Ursula von der Leyen's concern. The point is that even as Ursula von der Leyen makes these statements, even as she talks about energy independence from Russia, reports are circulating that the levels of gas in the European reserves have now fallen below 50%, alarmingly low for this time of year, just saying, with no clear picture of where the supplies are going to come from over the course of the spring and summer, with Europe increasingly obliged to import Russian oil, laundered mostly from India, and Russian liquefied natural gas, which is gradually displacing American natural gas on the European gas market, just saying. Anyway, and with gas prices in Europe now rising back to the highest levels they've had for 2 years, apparently. So all of those achievements, the solving of the problem of Russian natural gas, the liberation from Russian natural gas, well, it's coming at an awful cost, and it looks as if it's going to be reversed. So, from a European point of view, the Americans and the Russians dealing with each other, coming to agreements, the Americans downsizing their presence in Europe at a time when the Russians are looking increasingly powerful and strong. All of that is going to make the Europeans extremely nervous. Not, though, as if the European leaders, Germany, France, Britain, or Brussels, show any real plan about how they're going to address any of these problems. We have people like Orban and Fico, and perhaps before long, new governments in Austria and Romania. I understand that in Romania, by the way, the acting president has now stepped down, which perhaps finally opens the way for proper elections to take place in Romania, which, if it does happen, with all the candidates standing, these are very, very big ifs, could result in Mr. Georgescu being elected president of Romania, in which case another of the countries that has been supporting Project Ukraine within Europe could reverse positions. Anyway, the European leadership, the British leadership, is looking at all of this, and all of this must be making them increasingly nervous. If you want to see how nervous they are, go to the European media today, to all the big news outlets. You will see how these reports of the contacts, the discussions, the conversations between Putin and Trump, how they're not being reported at all, or if they are being reported, they are being given minimal coverage. It's not what the Europeans want to see happen. And anyway, we will see how the Europeans respond if, as I said, at some point Putin and Trump do meet and they do decide to cut a deal. Just saying. So, just a few other quick things. I noticed that amongst the people that General Kellogg has met, or at least I've seen reports to this effect, he's now met the new British ambassador to Washington, Lord Mandelson. Again, that might put Kellogg at odds with some of the more MAGA-inclined people in Trump's circle who apparently dislike Mandelson. Pete Hegseth will attend the next Rammstein meeting, but again, fully consistent with the Americans gradually distancing themselves from Project Ukraine. He's going to pass chairmanship of the Rammstein group to British Defence Secretary John Healey. I discussed all of this yesterday, and I said how absurd the British look if they really believe that they can take the lead on Ukraine. We are at that very strange and complicated point when one senses that the end game is underway, when moves towards some kind of American disconnection from the conflict are starting, but we don't yet have a clear sense of the shape of the outcome. I remember this same thing happening with the Paris negotiations between the Americans and the North Vietnamese to end direct American involvement in the conflict in Vietnam. And the same happened with the negotiations between the Americans and the Taliban, which took place in Doha, which resulted in the Americans finally extricating themselves from the conflict in Afghanistan. In both cases, one could see the direction of travel, which was the Americans pulling out. But one couldn't really get an exact picture of what the final outcome, of how the final outcome would be shaped. It's important to say, in addition, that whilst the Paris negotiations and the Doha negotiations did finally produce agreements between the Americans and the North Vietnamese and between the Americans and the Taliban. In the end, those agreements did not end the conflicts, the two respective conflicts, or decide the situation on the ground. That was decided by the local actors, and in each case, it resulted in an outright defeat for the former American proxy, with the fall of Saigon and the fall of Kabul. I would not be surprised at all if something very similar were to play out in Ukraine. But anyway, whatever the details, however this goes, my clear sense is that America has decided that it wants to leave, that Project Ukraine is unsustainable. They're coming up with all sorts of weird ideas of bribes to the Russians to buy them off and threats to the Russians to bully them into submission. Things that I've seen happen many times with the Americans before. The Russians will shrug their shoulders and stick to their positions, as the Taliban did, as the North Vietnamese did. The Americans will ultimately decide in their own interests that they need to cut their losses and go, and then it will be left to the local actors, the regional actors in the case of Ukraine, the regional actors, including the Europeans, to see what they can retrieve and whether they can pick up the pieces. And I suspect that in the case of Ukraine, we'll find that they cannot. Anyway, we are definitely living in most interesting times. More from me about all of this, but this is where I end my program today. Let me remind you once more that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel if you've liked this video. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.